Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to today's meeting of the Cabinet. I'm Councillor David Greenhalgh, the Leader of the Council, and I'm joined today by colleagues from the Cabinet, fellow Council members and officers of the Council. We'll move straight into the agenda as printed on the website. Item 1, declarations of interest. Have we any? Thank you. I'll take that as no. Moving to item 2, urgent business, if any. I have none. And therefore we move to item 3, apologies for absence. Mrs. Ridge.
Thank you, Leader. We've got apologies from Councillor Ishmael and Councillor McMulkin is deputising.
Thank you very much. Minutes of the last meeting at item 4, enclosed and circulated. Are there any matters arising from those minutes? Can you please indicate then if you have any problems with them taken as a true record? I have no indications and therefore those are passed. Move then to item 5, the Towns Fund, Town Centre Investment Plan. Great pleasure in handing over to my colleague Councillor Martin Cox to present this item. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Leader. First of all, the purpose of this report is to seek approval for submission of Bolton Town's investment plan as a first stage to securing a town's allocation of £25 million. I'm asking for the Cabinet's support for that. The town's board was set up this year, January 2020, to make recommendations to bring forward schemes for first stage approval. The town's board has worked well and it came up with a list of priority projects. Members will be able to see those on page 7 and page 8 of the report. And from those priorities, we whittled those down to a submission of a number of schemes, which can be found on page 10 and page 11 of the report. And I'm seeking support from the Cabinet to submit this as Bolton's town's investment plan. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Martin. Councillor Zaman.
Thank you, Leader. I do support this proposal. I think this can play a very crucial role in terms of our regeneration agenda. So I just wanted to know a bit more about on the timescales, really. So if Martin could shed some light on this, what are the timescales for approval and moving these projects to the next stage? Because, as I'm sure you understand, people of Bolton are waiting very keenly for this regeneration work to start. So if you could please inform us on that. Thank you.
Martin.
Thank you, David. Well, if you look on page 3, it makes clear that this will be signed off by the board at the 22nd of October meeting. So hopefully within 3 weeks' time, the board will sign it off, and it'll then go to government as our first stage in a two-stage process. So it'll then really be in the hands of the government as to whether or not they want to take forward Bolton as a scheme. Just to give some background, there are over 100 authorities, local authorities, that have submitted or are in the process of submitting bids. It is a competitive bid, and whilst we are confident that we have a robust bid, there's no absolute guarantee that we will access part or all of the £25 million. We think it's a good bid, and we are hopeful that it will be successful, but I should make it clear to members at this stage that this is part of a competitive process.
Yeah, can I come back, Leader, very quickly? I understand what Martin has just said. I read that it will be approved at the board, and maybe I should have made it clear what I was trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at really is what Martin has just referred to, which is moving to the next stage, which is getting this work done. So if this bid, firstly, I would like to know, and I think my other members would like to know, when are we likely to get a decision on this? When can we move to the next stage? That's one. And secondly, if this bid doesn't get through, how do we get to that stage? How do we deal with it? Can we still progress with these regeneration projects in our town centre, which is key to what we are trying to do? Thank you.
Well, what I will say, Councillor Zaman, is everything has been positive so far, and don't forget we have heard only in the last fortnight that we have £1 million coming to us ahead of 1 million of that 25 million, which is coming to us ahead of time scale, so we can get some of those proposals up and running and working. My understanding is from very much informal conversations that we should hear back by the end of the year, although we all know the current climate that we're living in, and often things are getting delayed, and that it's very much, if I know of all the government proposals at the moment, that they want to see developments happening and progress being made very quickly. And timescales that I've been informed of are in the regeneration, for those that are successful, starting happening around March, April time. But can I bring in the director, Jerry, please, if he wants to clarify any of this position?
Thank you, Leader. Yes, the proposals will go in on the 30th of October. There is then a period for reflection by the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Governments. They then will issue us with a heads of terms, which they say will clarify exactly which projects they wish us to follow up. We will have 12 months to work up each of the projects in detail. That will have to be done according to the government's Treasury's Green Book. So we need to be clear about what the added value of these projects are to the local economy, and we need to be clear that they meet all the requirements of the funding stream. At the end of that period, then we will be able to go ahead and deliver the project. So you are looking at a 1-year period before we are in a position to go ahead and start delivering on these projects, unless we can convince the ministry to give us some leeway and to allow us to advance some of these projects. As the leader has already said, we have been given permission to spend an additional £1 million on one advanced project. We haven't ruled out the possibility that the ministry may allow us to go ahead with some of our other projects on an advanced basis as well, but we have yet to have that confirmed, and we won't get that confirmed until we've got feedback on our initial submission, which goes in, as I said, at the end of October.
Councillor Hayes.
Yes, thank you, Leader. Firstly, let me say I think we all would support this bid, or I would hope we would, because any money coming into Bolton is good, and I think the bid to me does look good. But the question is a matter of process. The board itself, quite understandably, it's predominantly business people and other great and the good in most cases. But I noticed that there's only 2 council politicians on it, and they're both members of the ruling group. Is there no provision for there to be an opposition member there?
There certainly is a move from the government for this to be non-political. It's chaired, as you know, by Belinda Beaver, who is the head of the Chamber of Commerce. Its vice chair is Baroness Newlove from the university, and as you say, the vast input is from people involved in Bolton but non-political, and the decision goes in from the town's board. Does not come in. Does go in from the cabinet, so it is very much at, I'm not going to say it's at arm's length, because of course there is in essence, of course, our officer team are there, but I think it's very purposeful that government set up a system that was not in any way the identification of political balance. Now, we can all judge about whether that was right of government to do that, but it certainly has been a process that I've observed and watched and has worked incredibly well. I don't think it's meant to demean politicians. I don't think it's meant to exclude them. I just think it was meant for this was a process that was put across the whole of the country for all the people that had the Towns Fund. Of course, you'll know the High Street Funds has had incredible political input, which has been just treated a little bit differently and has been chaired by the boards have been chaired by politicians. So there's been two very, very different approaches, and I think it will be interesting to compare and contrast, and maybe government is doing that, but the Towns Fund has been very much, and the Towns Board has been treated very much localisation, which has not been all political involvement and inclusion. So it'll be interesting. I mean, the High Streets Fund, as I've said, is predominantly locally led, again, local businesses and residents, but led and championed, as it were, by local politicians. So it'll be interesting to look at the two outcomes and how they both work, but they have had two very, very distinct approaches from government.
Can I come back on that, please, Leader?
Yeah.
I take as read what you said. I'm sure it'll come out very well. But I've got to register some concern that the government quite frequently in many areas seems to be trying to bypass the local political processes. It may be all well and good in this particular case, but we see time after time that government seems not to want to give any powers to local authorities. But I'll leave it at that.
Well, as I say, we've not seen that with the high streets, which are equal pots of money. And of course, we as an administration have given the powers very much straight back to not politicians from our own group. So we can't be accused of taking, when we have had politicians, we've allowed in Little Eva, we've allowed UKIP to take the lead. In West Horton, we've allowed your group, the Liberal Democrats, to take the lead. And in Falmouth and Kearsley, we've allowed Falmouth and Kearsley First to take the lead, where those have the majority of the politicians. So, and in Horwich, we've allowed Horwich and Blackrod First to take the lead. So I don't think we can be accused of politically monopolising anything. We were given the criteria, and you know, it could have been a very political heavy committee. The committee has worked very well. We've had the Civic Trust on there, we've had local organisations on there, and the feedback we've got from it has been very positive, but it remains to be seen. We've seen the priorities that have come up with. The consultation worked very well. Of course, I don't know how many councillors, but they had the opportunity to feed into the consultation process from the Towns Fund. So I think it's been up to now a very positive piece of work, and all partners have really come together and worked extremely well. But it remains to be seen, and we'll see the outcome. But I do take your comments on board and respect them, Councillor Hayes. Councillor Pete, yeah.
Sorry, I'm not criticising this council at all, David. You should realise that. It's more directed at government, not this council.
All right. Thank you, Roger. Councillor Peel.
Thanks, Leader. Just to add my 2 pence into that last conversation, I mean, the reason the High Street funds is politically led has probably got more to do with local decisions in Bolton rather than Westminster, because I do agree with what Councillor Hayes has said about it having just a very small minority of political leaders on. It is pretty typical, it is pretty standard for this government to do that. Private sector good, public sector bad, yet the public sector actually then lead on it and are expected to deliver it, and will certainly take the flak if anything goes wrong. I think, just on a side issue, if the current pandemic crisis has taught us anything in this country, and that is sometimes the public sector is the best organisations to lead on it, and the private sector led us down time and time again, as we've seen with track and trace but I do. I am going off the point a bit. Just following up Councillor Zaman's question. I think really what Councillor Zaman was getting at, what I'm quite interested in, is this 25 million fund is in addition to that original 100 million plus that was put into our massive regeneration plans for Bolton Town Centre, and everybody supports it naturally. But the question is that then that 25 million then is additional. It's additionality, as far as I understand, to the original 100 million. So what is the plan B? Because of course you do seem confident, Leader, that our bid will be successful. Maybe you know something we don't, but there always has to be a plan B. So if the bid isn't successful, if finances have changed radically over the last couple of months in terms of government priorities, then what happens is we're not successful, and there's other places that are, or even the amount is feasibly reduced. So if we're not successful, which is not something any of us want to see, what is the plan B? What gets jettisoned then from regeneration plans? It might be better if Jerry answers that one. Thanks very much.
Well, I'll bring Jerry in, but first of all, I would say that the Towns Fund is an important part, as are the High Street funds of our town's regeneration. But as you will know, Councillor Peel, they are not the whole picture, and they're not an either or, and never have been an either or, of the main regeneration plans in terms of the 5 main intervention areas, which are still being progressed as best they can within the current climate, the economic climate we find ourselves in. So it's not an either or. It's not a case of this, we've put all our eggs in one basket with, in terms of the Towns Fund and the High Streets Fund. I personally, and you know, these words can come back to haunt me, but I shall be very, very surprised if we do not get some proportion of our bid for the Towns Fund. I'd be very surprised if that does not happen. But if it doesn't, it doesn't mean that the plans or the work that we've done on go to waste. It just means that we've got some very good schemes built up, oven ready, as you might want to call them, to move ahead straight away when any other further grants or applications come forward at any other level, whether that be at GM level or government level. But as I say, I'd be very surprised if we did not get a proportion of our ask for the Towns Fund, and indeed the High Street funds as well. But that, as I say, does not affect all the work that Jerry's department are doing in terms of the other intervention areas, and we've got, you know, a progression of one later on the agenda. And those 5 intervention areas still remain very much in our minds, as do other sites currently. We've got the SAM coming up, which is all about land transfers and land releases for development and regeneration. So I will bring Jerry in, but it's not a case of an either or. We have many irons in the fire currently. Jerry?
Thank you, Leader. Thank you, Leader. Just to clarify, it is competitive in as much as we have to meet certain ratios in terms of value for money for any money that we spend. It isn't competitive as we understand it from the point of view that we are competing with other areas for this money. We've already been allocated 25 million, subject to us meeting the criteria in terms of value for money and return on investment that the government are asking for. Then we should be able to hopefully get it, the 25 million. If we didn't get the 25 million, we got less because we couldn't meet that criteria for whatever reason, then we'd simply have to look at these projects from a different angle, and we'd have to try and find another way of funding them. That's the situation pretty much with all projects that we're involved in. We have a primary route, if you like, to fund these projects. Sometimes that doesn't always work out, and you have to chase other avenues. So we do the same, but as the Leader says, we will have a number of well worked up projects that should, we hope, justify the government investment. and it will therefore allow us to go ahead and start delivering these projects. And the timing is, as you say, is an issue in terms of when the money will come through and when we will get the go ahead to actually start working on these. But you have to believe that there's some priority, that the government are giving this some priority, and they've said to us that they will get decisions that will allow us to go as fast as we can during the course of the next year, and that's what we expect to happen. There are 26 members on the board. I take the point about representation, but there are very clear guidance given to officers at the time. We've followed that guidance, but I've got to say that officers have not been unaware of the situation, and in fact, if you look at the projects that have been largely worked up by officers of this council, they all involve council assets. So ultimately, there is a huge amount of control over this project through dint of the fact that these assets can only be deployed with the consent of this cabinet in the course of this meeting and subsequent meetings, no doubt, when other projects will come forward with some of the detail of these projects. So although the board have the responsibility for the overall plan, there's no doubt that the council and opposition members, as part of that council, will have a pretty main role to play in the approval of or not of these projects as they come through. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Jerry. Councillor Zaman, did you want to come back in?
Yes, Leader, thank you. Just very quickly. Leader, you responded to Roger Hayes' question by saying that Bolton Town Board was a non-political setup. Now, I mean, firstly, I don't think anything is non-political. But secondly, the government may well have said, look, this board needs to be led by the private sector, but that doesn't mean that politicians can't be on it. Now, you've got 5 politicians on it. You've got 2 Tory MPs, 1 Labour MP, and the leader and the deputy leader of the council on this. So what is stopping you from putting somebody from the opposition on the board? Is there restriction from the government that you can only put MPs on the board and the leader and the deputy leader on the board? I mean, this is something which confuses me. It would help if you could provide a bit more information on that. Thank you.
Well, I can certainly get Jerry to share the criteria with you if that would help. I mean, this conversation was had earlier on. It was I asked officers from the criteria to build up what they drew from the criteria. They had received all the documentation to build up what they felt the makeup of the board should be. I signed it off. I was happy with it in that I was reliant on officers that was what the criteria suggested. You're right. I mean, I have been talking purely about local politicians. You're right in terms of council politicians. As we've seen, the government have done recently with other certain decision making, they have brought MPs into the equation, and the 3 MPs have been invited to the board meetings and make contributions as well. But I can certainly get Jerry to forward that criteria to you if that's helpful. Jerry? That
would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. Just in summary, the key criteria that we were given were that 1, it had to be chaired by a member of the private sector person. 2, that our MPs had to be on the board, all MPs. 3, that it had to be a cross section of stakeholders in Bolton, voluntary sectors, education, and other organisations that might contribute to the project, such as the Arts Council, GMCA are on there and so on, and that it would not be dominated by local politicians. That was basically the main criteria. There are 26 members on the board. As you say, we actually were trying to keep it down to about a dozen, I think, to begin with. We ended up with 26, and we did try to keep to these guidelines as much as we could. We didn't, as to the political representation, it was a matter for the administration to discuss and decide how many and who should be that representation. But we were quite clear, or the instructions we were given were quite clear, that we had to maintain a minimum number of of local elected members on the board.
Well, can I come back, Leader, very quickly to what Jerry has just said? Because if you talk about stakeholders, so clearly now Jerry has just said that the decision was for the local leadership. So it's not the government which has decided that you can't put a member of the opposition on it. It's the local leadership that has decided to not put a member of the opposition on it. So in terms of stakeholders, I feel that the opposition is one of the main stakeholders in this. And by putting one member from the opposition on the board, which would have taken it to 27, I don't think would cause an awful lot of trouble in terms of numbers. So I find that a bit difficult to accept that the government has asked us not to put any member of the opposition on it. Thank you.
Well, I can only say that I was presented, which I signed off, but I was presented after officers presented me with a full makeup of the board for me to sign off the membership. I'll go no further. We'll take this offline and we can discuss it, Akhtar. I'm happy to do that. And if there is something to be learned from this, then I'm happy to learn from it. But I was presented with a list from officers of the council, which presented me to sign off after they had read and taken on the criteria of what they felt the meeting and the membership of that board should be. And I accepted that and I signed it off. Now we can take this offline. I'm happy, and if there is things to be learned from this, then as I say, I'm happy to learn from them. I have to say the process has been extremely good and has worked well. It in no way set out to preclude or ignore members of the opposition. I think you've seen from the way we've conducted other affairs, we've had no intention of doing that at any stage.
No, but, leader, can I just make a very quick point? All I'm saying is, I have seen the guidance from government. There is nothing in that guidance that excludes the main opposition from this board. This decision was to be made at local level, and the local administration has decided to do that. And all we are saying is that it should be reviewed. That's all. Thank you.
We will certainly look at the process and the way it was done, definitely, and we'll get back to you with an update, Akhtar.
Thank you.
So the recommendation before us is for the Cabinet is to seek approval to support the town, to recommend to support the Towns Board in its submission of Bolton's Town Investment Plan. Members of the Cabinet, can I just ask you to indicate, please, by just unmuting, just to say that you support that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
aye.
Yeah,
Yes.
support it, David, but isn't there other people who want to speak, David? Have you?
Oh, sorry, there are. I apologize. Mary, apologies. Councillor Brady.
Okay, thank you, Leader. I'm not sure if you can see me. I'm in the kitchen. It's just a clarification, actually. Page 8 of the report lists a number of projects, and one of them states Bolton Market Hall. Is that the market or the Market Hall, as older members may remember?
It is definitely the market.
Okay, right. Thank you very much.
It has been brought out that before, and that it has been told to remove that. Obviously, just clearly, it hasn't. But thanks for pointing out again. It should be the market. Yeah, market.
Thank you.
Councillor Hayes.
Yes, thank you, Leader. I almost wish I hadn't raised that issue now, to be honest, but I'll make two things clear. Firstly, I think the administration in Bolton has done its best to be inclusive, and I recognise that. I do have very different views about the government, which I think is deliberately undermining local government, but I'll be more said at other places. But I certainly don't blame you or the administration here for trying to do anything underhand. But the point I would make, we know we've got a very balanced council. We know we've had all party support for the principle, and we all know that there's a likelihood that, or a possibility that control could change. And I think it's important that the council keeps in the same line, in the same direction, And I think it would be sensible for you to review the constitution of that if you can. I'm not expecting massive local government representation on it. I have no wish myself to be on it, but I honestly do think it would be sensible to have a member of the opposition as a member of that board.
Will do. Thank you, Councillor Hayes. So moving on to the next item, it is the SAMP Strategic Asset Management Plan. Councillor Cox, please.
Thank you very much, Leader. Members will have a copy of the report in front of them. This is a long-awaited and substantial piece of work. It's the culmination, in fact, of many years of work. We have been for a number of years without a strategic asset management plan, but if we can adopt this today, we'll have one in place for the period 2020 to 2025. I think it's a hugely significant and important piece of work. We've got a huge portfolio of strategic assets in the town, and in and amongst those assets we have things which are strategically important to us and require further investment. We have assets that will be important to us in our future plans, and we need to be able to invest in them. And of course we have assets that are neither strategically important nor do we have any long-term plans for. We have here what is in effect our strategic asset management plan, and alongside it we have a number of other policies to deal with other issues such as acquisitions and disposals. Leader, this has been already to a PDG, and we had a number that was on the 27th of July, and we had a number of submissions from both members of the ruling group and members of the opposition. I think most people saw it as an important piece of work, strategically important piece of work, something that was long overdue, and I'm very happy to bring this to Cabinet today for adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Councillor Zaman.
Thank you, Leader. I have been waiting very impatiently, I should say, for this report because in the very recent past I have experienced what happens when you don't have such a policy in place. So it's a welcome move. But having said that, I have read through the officer's report and the associated documents. So if I could just give you my comments on that, and then they could all be addressed all together. So the officer report quite rightly refers to involvement of elected members in any decision making in relation to assets in various wards, which is very important. And then I started looking at the actual policy document. So the SAMP policy, which is attached as an appendix, I couldn't find any reference within that main document to elected member involvement. That's one. Secondly, the community asset transfer policy, which is also associated with the same report. It says draft on it on the front page, but then when I started reading through it, it appears draft because the formatting hasn't been done. You know, there are. I mean, if you read through it, you will know what I'm trying to say. So somebody needs to check before these reports come to the Cabinet, I think. And again, in that report, I started looking for elected member involvement because, you know, any transfer of assets in a ward, I would have thought you would involve local elected members within that. So again, I couldn't find any reference to elected member involvement. The only reference I could find was on page 9, where it mentioned executive cabinet member. Nobody else, you know, so that's something which needs looking at again. And then you look at the asset management policy and the disposal policy, same thing. You know, I looked for elected member involvement. There is absolutely nothing in those documents. So could somebody either tell me, you know, what to interpret in those policy documents, which says that elected members will be involved. And if this is not part of these policies, then I would ask you to take these documents back and include those elements in these policies, because later on, when these decisions are implemented or when decisions are made, these are the policies which will be used. Thank you.
David, could I just come back on that?
Yeah, Councillor Cox.
Could I just refer, Councillor, just on the main policy that's to be adopted, could I just revert Councillor Zaman to point 2.10, where it says executive members and ward councillors will be consulted and engaged on matters of land and property ahead of recommendations.
Well, I've accepted that. In the main officer report, yes, there is reference to elected members.
And then can I then refer you to the disposals policy? Item 3.1, local ward members will be consulted in the following circumstances before disposing of surplus land or property and the release or variance of restricted covenants as part of the process for advertising the disposal of public open space, before submitting planning applications on council owned land, and before a report goes to Cabinet or Cabinet Committee, assets on land or property within their ward.
All right, sorry, I missed that. I may have missed that. Yeah.
I think we've been very clear that from the PDG, Councillor Zaman, that was something that absolutely came to the fore, and we've been very, very clear in prioritising that in the papers, in both sets of papers. So I think, you know, at 2.10 out of the first and 3.1 of the second, ward members are very clearly identified as being at the key to that consultation process and involvement in the process.
Well, what community asset transfer policy, I think that doesn't have any reference to elected member involvement. So I think you need to look through that.
Well, I think we couldn't have been clearer at every stage that ward members will be included. Okay. Councillor Peel.
Thanks, Leader. I mean, it's fair enough that you say that you are very clear that ward members will be part of the consultation process when it comes to community asset transfers. But the problem is, I mean, I couldn't find a reference in that. That was the one document that I was honing in on, in fairness, and I couldn't find a reference to that in there. Now, if it is in there, then fair enough. If Councillor Cox can do his very quick research for us again and point out that I've missed it, then fair enough, I'll hold my hands up. The problem is, if it's not specifically contained within the policy, then that then causes problems when officers are expected to implement that policy. That's the issue. And I mean, we've got this problem. We've got an issue with land sales, whereby a report went to Councillor Cox at the exec member meeting without members being consulted. It was polled because the report should never have been there in the first place, because we hadn't had this cabinet meeting. I mean, this adoption of the policy comes first, rather than charging in there and trying to sell land without consulting elected members. But the other issue is on community assets. I think this is a secondary area where the council officers will come under fire if they find that assets are being transferred, etc., without the benefit of it's not just a box ticking exercise about consulting, it's about their local knowledge. It's about what they know about various community groups or the needs in that ward or the particular building concern. So it is important, and I would appreciate it, Leader. I know, and I'm not saying that you're doing anything deliberate, but if it isn't specifically in that strategic asset policy, it does need to be put in there. The second point, and I would appreciate an answer to that, if Martin has found something, then he can let us know. The other point I want to make, again, about the community asset transfers, is I feel very strongly about, I have found a reference to it, but I'm not sure it's strong enough. On page, it's page 9 of the actual community assets transfer policy, so it's that separate document. And it says, well, first of all, it says agreements will be drafted to prevent the asset being assigned or sold. I mean, I should hope so. I mean, that should be taken as read. I mean, fine, stick it in. You don't want assets being sold that have been that are there for a particular community use. But the other bit, the sentence above it, is community asset transfer agreements or leases will include a service agreement that will explain the expected benefits of the community asset, etc. This is welcome, but I do think it must be stronger. There should be service level agreements which actually, where the council actually stipulates what it expects to get in terms of outcomes as a result of the asset transfer. What are the outcomes? If we give a grant to an organisation, and the one that springs to mind is the Unemployed Advice Centre on Deansgate, very tiny grant, very small, they have to jump through hoops, filling in quarterly reports, what they're doing with the money, this, that and the other. But if you hand a building over, which can be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, they don't seem to have to go through the same rigorous monitoring. And I say this with being constructive for advice as possible. I think we could end up getting into some bother if we didn't really have that as strong as possible. So you transfer a building to a community group, very worthwhile group who want to do great things. The personnel could change, different people could take over that group with different agendas. It has to be bolted down what the council, what the community get in return. And so I would appeal to you to have another think about expanding that sentence, because it's literally like, 10 words that it leaves it all open to interpretation. That there must be a service level agreement, there must be outcomes, it must be monitored quarterly, etc. Those returns must come into the council, because if we do that, and if we act in a true partnership with the community groups, we will, as a council and as our varying communities, get a lot more benefit from what this asset transfer is trying to achieve. Thanks.
David, if I could just come back on that.
Yeah, Councillor Cox.
Yeah, I mean, I would point out we have gone 8 years without any policy in place whatsoever. Let's start from
we'll get it right when you try and fix it then.
And I would make the other point that, again, I'm not sure what opposition members aren't seeing here. In the community asset transfer 4.13, it says the assessment of the application will be carried out using various council resources, including the most appropriate method for the process, e.g. a panel of relevant council leads may be convened to discuss the application and reach consensus before making the recommendations to the executive cabinet member. Now, if that needs clearing up, or the language on that isn't clear enough, then I'm quite happy for officers to do that. But that means to me that local leads, local council leads, will be consulted on asset transfer before a recommendation is made to the executive member. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you. Councillor Hayes.
May I come back, Leader? Just, it's the same point, so we'd end up just going back on ourselves.
Go on, Councillor Peel.
Thank you for your patience. Councillor Cox, I'm sorry, I did read that bit, and local council leads is not the same. I mean, what on earth is a council lead? That to me is either a member of the executive or a shadow spokesperson. It should be this. What we're asking for is the ward councils on the ground where that asset is based, whether it's in Horwich, Kersley, wherever
I
it's
think
best.
that's fair. I think that's fair enough, Councillor Peel. I don't think we're disagreeing about anything here. I think that could do with being strengthened up or made clear, and I'm quite happy to do that.
I appreciate that, Martin. And I don't think anybody's like I am live again. I appreciate that, Martin. Thank you. And also, could somebody respond to the points I was raising about getting the service level agreement really tight? Thank you.
Just going to bring in the chief, Tony.
Thank you, Leader. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's a fair comment. I mean, I think we need to set something which is of a light touch. I mean, we don't want to make them jump through loads of hoops, but if we're giving monies of type in form in terms of cash or revenue, then I think conversely, if we're given an important asset which belongs to the council for someone to use for community use, we need a mechanism to, I think, review that. So I think, again, in the spirit that has just been discussed about the previous improvement, we'll, I think, just slightly amend the policy to ensure that we're getting value for money and it's meeting the purposes as originally designed when the asset was transferred.
Thank you. Councillor Hayes.
Yes, thank you, Leader. I agree with the points that Nick made. We do need to consult with ward councillors. That's taken as read, and I'm very happy with the assurances we've given. We'll certainly be holding people to that. But on the general principle, I mean, I remember, and it's one of these all our yesterdays, I'm afraid, I remember many years ago, we had no idea what land we controlled. Many times I inquired about bits of land and was told, oh, that might be housing, it might not. This is very badly needed, let me say. We've needed it for a long time. Anybody who doubts that, just go onto the council intranet, go onto the maps section, put the layers on, which tells you about council-owned buildings, council-owned land, and you'll be amazed what we own throughout the borough. Absolutely amazed. Things that you can never understand why we ever got them in the first place. And when you do a bit more digging, the state of some of the land and the state of some of the buildings we own is absolutely ridiculous. So in general, yes, it's a very badly, very overdue policy, basically a very good policy, which, yes, it needs to be tightened up perhaps, but I would very much support it. But as ever, the devil is in the detail. When you come and want to sell a bit of land in Smithills, you'll probably find me changing my tune, but be prepared for that. The general principle, yes, totally agree with you. Totally.
Thank you, Roger. Councillor Howarth.
Thank you, Leader. First, thank you. First, just a comment on community asset transfer, which is, of course, that some elected members have raised this, if you like. They've raised the benefit that you can actually get from community asset transfer in the past, where we know the voluntary sector, the community sector, social enterprises and even cooperatives. I know we've had a food cooperative in Bolton where, certainly at Bolton CVS, they've got some real experience of this, and some of that experience is because they've been able to learn from other parts of Greater Manchester where this has gone really very well. And one of the things that seems stand out about this is it protects. There's a protection issue around the value of that asset that is the council's asset, because one of the hardest things to see is when an unused, if I say building, if an unused building very quickly slides, becomes decrepit, becomes at risk. I mean, the finance that can accrue is really quite problematic. So I've always seen the role there for community asset transfer to benefit the council as an asset portfolio holder financially, and I'm grateful for the officers who've put all these policies together, that is actually made extremely clear in that policy, community asset transfer. I just want to give another view on one aspect of the disposal policy, which is that, again, a well-written policy. And of course, it says where local ward members are to be consulted, they will be given at least 10 working days to respond, and all comments, whether in support or objection to the proposal, will be included in the report. However, I thought about this, and because this is land and assets in the community, can be really quite substantial, that, can't it? 10 working days just doesn't feel long enough. Now, I know the policy says it's, what does it describe it as? It says as a minimum, or at least is the phrase. But the thing is, I thought about the reality. We all know what happens when you put days in a document, it becomes the norm. So, you know, my choice would be, of course, I'm working alongside, what we do here is we work alongside the planning law that, of course, gives elected members and the public much longer time periods. I mean, we know why we've got those time periods in planning, because it's the planning law. But anyway, I'm just saying we work side by side with other things that are going on, and reflecting on that, that can be one house. We all know that, but the same in planning, the same time intervals kick in. But this is assets and this is land spaces. 10 working days isn't a lot for elected members to really think about and have some discourse with residents, with businesses, whatever. So I myself would change that to 20 working days. Some people might say, "Whoa, that slows the process down," but I think I would. I support that more, actually, Leader. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Howarth. Martin or Jerry, do you want to come back on a view of that?
Leader, I think that's a good point myself, because on reflection, 10 working days doesn't allow for somebody being on leave for 2 weeks in itself. So I would regard 20 working days as reasonable, and we could amend it accordingly. Do you have anything that you would want to say to Councillor Cox?
I think it's a reasonable point. I think one of the difficulties with this, I mean, I've spent the last couple of weeks going around visiting different sites, and of course you have sites which are, you know, no bigger than a sort of, you know, couple of square meters. So you've got these tiny sites, and yet of course you've got some other sites which are a number of acres and may require longer. But in terms of a tweak or a change to the policy to give local members a little bit longer, I think that's fair enough. I think Councillor Howarth made a fair point.
Councillor Zaman.
Yeah, thank you, Leader. I'm very grateful that Councillor Cox has given assurance that these changes will be made to make it absolutely clear. And it also goes to show what role policy development groups can play to eliminate some of these concerns that we are discussing at Cabinet. But once these changes have been made to these policy documents to ensure that there is very clear reference to elected member involvement in all the associated final policy documents, would these policies come back to the Cabinet? Would they be shared? Well, how I know Tony is shaking his head, but yeah, I would like him to tell us how would that be shared with us so that elected members are satisfied that there is clear reference to elected member involvement in relation to those assets. Thank you.
Chief.
Thank you, Leader. I'm sorry for shaking my head, because I suppose after waiting for 8 years, the bus is well overdue. So it gives us an opportunity to get this sorted. We will clearly take reference to the points that made in regards to your comments and a range of other members. Those will be shared, so they will come back out. But we need to get on with using this documentation tool. And I think it's the point that is, having been without something like this for 8 years, this gives us an opportunity to test it, to run it, and therefore, you know, we would want to evaluate it at some point in the future to say, yeah, it's working, but we need to tighten it up. So you have our absolute assurance that the points that have been raised will be highlighted. Whether the wording is exactly right, whether it's the right emphasis, is always open to interpretation. But I think let's look at the community asset transfer. If the ward members are not aware of that community asset transfer well in advance, if they know nothing about it, or if they don't support it, and ward members say that, then that's quite a strong position. And to ignore that would be kind of almost, well, why would we do it? Because there's no support from the people that it's meant to be serving, and one or two other considerations. So I think let's work on the basis of some trust here. We'll get them amended. Joe and his team have worked incredibly hard on this. We'll send them out, we'll share them with you, and then obviously we'll go from there. But you can have our assurance that we're in a far stronger place for the reasons you've all said, rather than previously without any framework. Back to you, Leader.
Councillor Peel, did you want to come back?
No, that was from earlier, Leader, thanks.
All right, thank you. Councillor Brady.
All right, thank you, Leader. Yeah, I appreciate the inclusion of ward members in any decisions on assets within their ward, but I wonder, can we have some clarity, please, on assets that have been inherited from former UDCs? You can see where I'm going with this. You know, these are assets, particularly in Horwich, that Horwich Council had, that then became Bolton Council assets by default in 1974. And I know we previously touched on this, obviously, with Pickutsfield, and I think Councillor Hornby had a motion in council as well about benefits from sale of assets in areas coming back. So just some clarity, please.
Jerry.
Thank you, Leader. I think this is probably one for Councillor Cox here. I mean, my own view is that we're discussing assets that are owned by the council, and we would seek to get the best return we can, commensurate with the community needs, etc. As to whether or not the proceeds of these assets and what happens to them, I don't think that's a question for me to answer, to be honest. My view is just to realise the receipt or the benefit. It's up to members to decide what happens to that benefit or receipt, in my view.
I mean, I think the legal position is, Mary, of course, that these assets do belong to Bolton Council. I understand, and I have a wry smile on my face because I too represent an area that was part of an old urban district council, Turton Urban District Council, and both members of Bromley Cross and Bradshaw are both part of that. So we too come from an old urban district council, but of course part of those negotiations when the UDCs were taken and came into the remit of Bolton Council was that there were asset transfers. And so that is the legal position. I think you know that. I think well, I know you know that, but I admire you fighting your corner for your area as you always do. But the legal position is very clear. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, but you can't blame me for trying.
Absolutely not. No, and I expect you to. So the recommendations are that given the amendments which have been discussed today, which will be circulated, it is to approve the Strategic Asset Management Plan, the SAM 2020-25, associated strategic objectives and associated policies, delegate authority to the Director of Place to Executive Cabinet Member to agree and update the actions and plans to deliver the strategy on an annual basis. I just want to say that this is a huge step forward, and I'm really pleased that as an administration, very early on, we recognise the importance of doing this, and I'm pleased it has got cross-party agreement. Certainly had at the PDG that this was a hugely important piece of work, and that it was worth the council resource and capacity to get this right and to get this policy in place. And I'm very proud to be an administration that within 18 months of us taking over, we've got to this position that we're able to present this to Cabinet. And thanks to the team and to Councillor Cox and also Councillor Hewitt as well, who I know has had considerable input into this as well, for their work on this and getting us to this stage. We will get the amendments in. We want it to have the support across the board and to get this through, and our absolute commitment to having ward member involvement in the process. So can I just ask Cabinet members to unmute and signify their approval, please?
Aye. Approve.
Yeah.
Approve.
Thank you. Thank you. So that is approved. We now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is just moving to my next page, Council Tax Support Scheme. And if I can invite Phil Rimmer, please, just to present this piece, please. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Leader.
Yes, just to give you some background to local council tax support in Bolton. So since April 2013, every authority has its own local council tax scheme. Prior to that, it was council tax benefit. And so we have an ability to amend that scheme each year and review the way that scheme is made up. This basically is a proposal asking permission to go out to consult on various options to change the scheme with effect from April 2021. In the main, what we're proposing is to consult with the public on the application of what we call a top slice. So since April 2017, there's been a 12.5% top slice in Bolton. What that effectively means is that everybody pays a minimum of 12.5% towards the council tax, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of their income. We put in forward 4 proposals to increase that 12.5% to either 17.5, 20, 22.5 or 25%. So the report sets out the impact of that, both in terms of the additional revenue that will bring into the council, but it also gives some worked examples of the impact that would have on residents depending on the circumstances and what the increase would be for them in real terms per week based on those various options. I've also included, and this is belt and braces, I'm taking some advice on this, but we are looking to just make a administrative, can't even say the word, we're looking to change Regulation 7 in our scheme, which effectively deals with persons from abroad, because you may remember that following Brexit, we introduced something called settled status. And so we just want our regulations to align and reword them. So I'll put that in as belt and braces, just in case we need to consult on that. Thank you.
Councillor Greenhouse, you're muted. Councillor Howarth.
Thank you, Leader. I have a few things that I need to say, I mean, we've just been reminded that the payment amount is currently at 12.5%. And in this document, which every document we get is, you know, there's a politician that's, or politicians, if you like, that are part of the policy that is presented. The first choice for the increase of the payment is the amount of 17.5%. And yet there isn't. There's obviously a choice that's been made that there isn't a consultation on an increase to 15%. And I'll come to why I'm pointing that out. So 12.5 to 17.5% is a rise of 5. Now, some of these things look like small amounts, but that is actually a 40% rise in the amount that would need to be paid. And that's what I'm saying. That's the first choice in this paper. So we've got the 40% rise that's in the paper. We've not got the 20% rise. That's not been chosen to be asked. That would take the contribution to 15%. Then the next 3 figures we've got 12.5 that would go to 20%. Well, that's actually the first time we consult above a 50% rise. It's actually 60%. I'm going to tell you that I'm not even sure whether that's the right thing to do, to consult at 60%. But then the next are 12.5 to 22.5, that's an 80% rise. And then again, 12.5 to 25%, that's a 100% rise. And I'm going to pose the question, why are you even considering, why are you even consulting on this, on those last 2? And I'd pose that question at 60% as well. We haven't had a political introduction to the paper, and I know that I can't speak too long, and I'm well aware I'm just giving a view. This is just a view. OK, so we haven't heard of you, for example, that this comes from a background of councils needing to survive and run almost exclusively on a reliance of council tax and business rates. And I do not approve of that. I think it's shameful, really. We're in a very difficult position, but I think it's a very difficult thing to be wanting to consult on the higher amounts that would be taken from people who have some of the least in this borough. the Regulation 7 that Mr. Rimmer has outlined, I would actually be grateful to find out if that is really about the fact that Citizens Advice Bureau are now saying, and I'm wondering if they're talking about the law, that if you go on a website of theirs, it will make it clear, even in a box, it will say, your benefits might stop if you don't have settled status by the 31st of December 2020. So I'm raising that because, of course, that's going to be part of the whole concern about people who really don't have a lot, who are in the borough and who will be facing increased council tax charges. So suggestions of cutting quite heavily, because the figures I've given you is about their contribution, but in a sense what this is about is cutting quite heavily, certainly in those last two figures that you're consulting on. And that would be happening without any reference at the present time to remonstrating at the government for their policies that I feel are damaging local government. The problem with this is that it feels like we're being forced to consult on taking money away from very low income families just because the Conservative government can't be bothered to help this borough in a way that is just and is fair in terms of human dignity when you look at the population that we serve. The current situation for too many in Bolton is deprivation, and that is where you always find debt. Universal credit payments, for example, can be cut substantially by the Department for Work and Pensions to repay various debts and loans. This is important because this does connect to council tax and the people we serve. People still wait 5 weeks for a first payment, and to cover that period of time, they can often take a loan out, and that would need to be repaid over 12 months. But the debts don't stop there. Many claimants are already burdened with tax credit debts, with the DWP having decided to use universal credit to pursue such debts, and that can be going back many years. Now, Citizens Advice again do estimate significant numbers of people in Bolton are behind on water bills, behind on energy bills. The same number are behind on council tax, and we've got people who are in rent arrears, and these are notable numbers, and that was reported in July. All these debts can be recovered by cutting universal benefit payments. Now, then you end up with parents who struggle to buy for their children food or nappies. I'm grateful for Phil Rimmer for including the examples to help us all understand the impacts of this. He's given us life examples of a single person with 2 dependents, for example, and I think it's a family, isn't it, with 4 dependents. So all of those examples help us. But the government of the day is now forcing the council to take money off people who are in dire straits. Now, sure, the government formula takes some account of deprivation, but it is not enough. It is not enough to help Bolton. And we have been unfairly hit by austerity policies, making it difficult for us to support our people. The size of the pot remains insufficient financially to compensate for COVID pressures, and this is putting this council in an extremely difficult position. We are now facing completely unacceptable levels of cuts going forward. Labour believe that the government have made sure, I'm afraid, this is the background to the finance, we feel they've made sure too much that the Shire districts have got more money. They call that, the government at the moment are trying to describe that as a correct allocation. No, we don't think that's correct at all. We think that that allocation is deeply unfair. On areas like Bolton, it means that a deprived area like Bolton gets much less, and we are sick of the government, I'm afraid, piling on extra funding streams to be found moreover from the council tax. We've got over 50% of our public that are in Band A. That's how council tax take. You know, so we've got a lot of people who are just getting by. This is the backdrop of injustice that means the council will now apparently consult on how it must take more council tax money from people who live in hardship already, people who are already needing some government welfare to get by. So, Leader, I do not support consulting on the higher percentage increases as set out in the paper today. Thank you.
Councillor Greenhouse, you're muted.
sorry, Sue, and I was saying something very positive about you as well, so I'll say it again, that you make your points very eloquently, and I have to say a large number of them I agree with. We are in some very difficult territory, and we do have to make some very difficult decisions, and we have to look at areas that we would think of previously that we would much rather not go there. But the position we're in, as you know, and you've had your presentation on the budget, is that we face some very, very unpalatable savings this year across the board, and that is the reality. So I acknowledge that position. This is a very difficult area. I'll bring in Phil after I've made my comments, but of course there are other help and other packages for those families who are struggling, and of course these packages do not involve at all, and these increases do not involve those of pensionable age. That's another important point that needs making. It's always very difficult, as you will know, Councillor Howarth, to work just with percentages, and percentages can seem very, very unfair, but in actual fact I would rather look in terms of real terms increases, and the example one of the actual amount per week that are the additional requirements should certain levels be approved. And first of all, you asked me why we started at 17.5. Well, 17.5 seemed very much midway in where currently our GM partners were at. There are 3 GM authorities currently, Labour run, that do use 20%. So this is just to get a picture overall of where GM is at the moment. 3 Labour authorities currently top slice at 20, and that is not to say that this year they won't be looking to increase that as well from that figure. So if you look at the what 17.5% looks at, in terms of an increase of a Band A property, it is 87 pence per week increase. Now I realise these are families on low incomes with many challenges, but that is the reality. And option 2, which is the 20%, £1.31. The vast majority of these affected residents are in Band A and Band B, the vast majority in Band A, and very limited as it goes further up the scale. Option 3, £1.74 per week, and option 4, £2.18 per week. This is just to show a variance of what those differences and what those mean in terms of what people are paying at the moment. So it gives you an overall picture. So percentages, even though you say like it's a 60% increase, it is actually only in real terms £1.31 per week extra at the 20% level. So people, that's why we're consulting. We want people to see the whole figures. We want to see the benchmarking. We want people to know what's already happening across Greater Manchester. And I have to say, in Labour-run authorities, and I realise those have been hugely difficult decisions for Labour authorities. I know they will have been in many cases. So, but it's important that people understand the real terms increase of what it actually means for people on the ground. And I'm just going to bring in Phil, if he can, just to talk about the additional safety nets that there are for families that are finding it increasingly difficult. Phil, if you could.
Yes, no problem at all, Leader. So I think one very important thing to point out is we do have a council tax hardship scheme, and currently there's a budget of £400,000, which is by far and away the most generous hardship scheme in Greater Manchester. And what that does enable us to do is to provide a safety net for those residents who are suffering financial hardship. So certainly if somebody had other debts, for example, and they were struggling to actually pay that additional amount, they can make an application to that particular fund, and based on the circumstances we can award the money through that particular budget. So that obviously is a major safety net for them. We also have probably one of the most generous local welfare provision schemes in Bolton, again compared to the rest of Greater Manchester. So that provides people with other types of support, including food support with gas and electric, because we do recognise for some people that is a large expense and they struggle to pay it. And we also help people with household goods as well. So again, that provides some additional support for some of those residents that are struggling. So we have got a couple of options there that we can support residents with if they find themselves in financial difficulty as a result of these changes.
Thank you, Phil. I think, Susan, you just want to come back on something. Yes, Councillor Howarth?
Yes, thank you. I do, Leader, and I want to come back on this. And I first of all want to say that I'm grateful that the officers, the good and proper officers, did actually mention this in the report. The fact that there is, it certainly says there are additional funding, that there's an additional funding pot where people in hardship can apply. And of course, Phil Rimmer has just told us about council tax hardship scheme and local welfare scheme, but the document made it clear, as it mentioned this, that those funds are limited, and good and proper officers right at the beginning will do that. They will say that, and that's quite right too. So we are apt, and they are limited. They are limited, and who knows how limited they're going to be going forward because of the cuts. So that's an acknowledgement that even with applications from people whose income status is going to be more problematic as we go forward, we know that from the reports that we've got. I say to you, Leader, that we're not going to be able to fulfil all the needs of those that will apply to those additional funds. We're not going to be able to fulfil. And I want us, or I want the council to have a look at whether it can do other things with finance. As you know, I've said I'm opposed to the state of finance that the government insists we have in local government. I would appreciate if you would look at all the other ways that you could save finance, and that we try and protect the needs of those that have some of the least in this borough. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, and I hope you will, with your colleagues, take part in the consultation. I mean, you've made your points very clear today, but I think it's important that you voice those in the consultation. Councillor Peel.
Thanks. Yeah, we obviously will respond to the consultation. I mean, one of the things that Councillor didn't mention is the fact that we don't even know what government's giving us anymore to support LCTS. It's just absorbed within the general budget, and that's the beginning of the end of the slow decline, isn't it? It's no longer ring fence money to support people on low income. Councillor did comment on something that I was going to say as well. We do have a hardship fund. We do have a local welfare scheme. It is limited, and the pressure on that is growing, and the pressure on that will continue to grow. The main point I wanted to make was, I agree on some levels that everybody, no matter what their income, should contribute something, even if it's symbolically small amounts. And I think we have that situation. I think there's some general principles in there that being seen to actually contribute something means that you feel that you're more part of the services that are actually being delivered for what you contribute. I do see the benefit of that, and that was certainly an argument when this 12.5% was first brought in a few years ago. But the principle of ability to pay must always be applied, and once you start lifting it from 12.5 to 17.5 to 20 or 25, then there is no limit. There's no longer a limit. That principle is being challenged massively, because next time it's 25 to 30, 30 to 40, etc. And before we know it, the symbolism is actually the other way around. Somebody symbolically gets a bit of help rather than symbolically paying towards services. And the thing is, all of this, the one thing that really hasn't been mentioned in Councillor's very good address on this is, none of this is the council's doing. None of this is the people's doing. This is to do with COVID, with the pandemic. with the appalling record of the government in terms of how it has handled this. There is growing evidence that a lot of money has been wasted, a lot of money has been directed at the wrong things, and we know now that Bolton Council, like every other council and probably most of the public sector, has got a huge financial headache facing it. Nothing to do with the efficiency of the council, nothing to do with our brilliant workforce in the council, nothing to do with the great services we provide, but everything to do with, sorry, you've got to find tens of millions of pounds in a single financial year to cut out your budget because we as central government made some fundamental mistakes right from the beginning. And one of the ways that we're going to do this is hit those with the least money by lifting what they pay in council tax. The very people who are most affected by COVID, because the evidence is showing that, the very people who are at risk of losing their jobs, the very people who are going to be massively affected when furlough ends, low-income people, people who are being bullied in many ways to go into work because there isn't sufficient support, people who feel they have no choice but to go into work because they cannot survive outside of work, depending who they work for, so they're not isolating at home. And this is just yet another kick in the teeth, really. And I appreciate, Councillor Greenhouse, that it's small amounts of money, 70 odd p a week, etc. But it's on top. The point I'm making is it's on top of everything else. It's on top of this, that, and the other. And I just think it's horrendous. You know, we've come through 10 years of recession. The budget cuts were certainly getting not easier, but more manageable. And now suddenly, because of this horrendous pandemic, and I've got to say the government's handling of it, the fingers point at the council that you have got to sort out this financial mess. It isn't acceptable. And I do hope, Leader, that the passion that you showed in standing up to the government in terms of restrictions, etc., with your name being bandied around the House of Commons, is the same kind of passion that you can share with Conservative colleagues and other parties on the Local Government Association that are campaigning strongly against councils having to face the brunt of this financial crisis. You know full well that if you do that and you use strong words against government, you'll get the full backing of this group in that, because it isn't the fault of any local councils or local council leaders that were in this financial mess. And this report is just the thin end of the wedge, isn't it? We all know there's going to be more and more and more of these horrible reports, stripping services, making people pay more for what they've not got. And there's going to be a lot more said about this in the future, as we all know. But that is my view at the moment, and we'll wait to see the results of the consultation. Thanks. You're on mute, David.
Sorry, apologies for that. All after this time and still on mute. Yeah, thank you, Councillor Peel. It is hugely difficult, and it almost sounds a cliche, doesn't it, that you know, we don't go into local politics to have to do this kind of thing, and we do face this year. You're right. I accept some of what you say in terms of, I think the part of the budget presentation is starts with an image of a perfect storm in terms of we have got the challenges of COVID, plus the fact we were an authority, and I don't criticise you as the former administration for this, because we supported the use of reserves, as you will know, but of course we deferred savings to future budgets, and to be having to make those reserves that we've carried forward in a year on top of all the COVID challenges, plus part of those COVID challenges, including stuff like the airport dividend and that repercussions from that, find us in a particularly challenging position financially, as we all know. And you're right, it's going to be the first of many very unpalatable discussions and consultations that we will, in essence, have to have with the public on how we as a council remain functional and solvent, while still, as you say, delivering on those services that we are proud of and that are led ably by our officers and our staff. So we're heading in for some really, really difficult times. I think that's all been said to you when you've all had your budget briefings. This is probably one of the first ones. It's probably not one of the ideal ones. I don't want it to set the tone, obviously, that we are in any way targeting those people who are less well off. This is just the first of a number of proposals that will be coming across many portfolios about services, some revenue based, some cutting in terms of reconfigurations of staff and how we deliver services, and some very positive agendas in terms of digitalisation, information, etc., which hope to save us money. So it's a massive piece of work that's incredibly challenging. We will wait to see the outcome of this consultation, and we will look at it, and it's clearly with a heavy heart, as you say, that any of us want to even start to go through these kind of processes, but it is unfortunately something that we are having to consider. I've got Councillor McMulkin indicating. Councillor McMulkin.
I'm live. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but
I don't know why the camera's on, but it doesn't seem to be working. You can hear me. That's the main thing.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Just
move the slider at the top of the monitor to the right.
Slider at the top of the monitor. All right. Is that it? No, it's pointing up in the air. You can't see me still. Anyway, I have serious concerns over this. This deeply worries me. I agree with much of what Councillor Howarth said previously. I know you said, David, in real terms, it's only 87p, I think you said. Well, in real terms, this is the difference for many people in whether they will eat that day or whether they will not. Those queues at the food banks are not getting shorter, they're getting longer. And I expect them to continue to grow in the next few months, unfortunately. We, at this point, none of us know the full impacts financially in terms of COVID. And this, as other councillors have already said, is another blow to those who can least afford it. So in its current format, I could not support this, and we will make our submissions within that consultation because it is extremely concerning. Thank you, David.
All right, thank you, Martin. I've not got any other indications on this to speak. So the recommendation is just to begin the consultation process on this. So can I just ask Cabinet members to unmute and signify their approval to go to consultation?
Approved.
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 Thank you. So that is approved to go to consultation. And now we go to item 8, which is the Crompton Place CPO. And Martin, Councillor Cox, and Jerry. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Leader. It's a relatively straightforward report of a rather complicated real estate deal, but basically it comes in two parts. The first part is to bring Cabinet members up to date with our task of site assembling the site around Crompton place. That's a significant piece of work, and it's also asking authority to promote a CPO to acquire any outstanding interests within the extent of the option plan. I'm conscious it is what we're asking is relatively straightforward, but it is a complicated real estate deal that we are trying to pull together here. It's something that's been part of the council's strategic plan for a number of years, and now that we have a planning application that has been to planning committee and agreed, we believe it's now time to mop up the rest of the site with a CPO. Thanks, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Zaman.
Thanks, Leader. Yes, I think this is something that I welcome. But if I just take you back to when we secured £100 million for our town centre, our declining town centre, I would say, people at Bolton are very keen to see development of the town centre. So once this land assembly takes place, how long will it take for us to move to the next stage, which is actually the demolition and then work on the new town centre facing the town hall? When would that begin?
I'll let Jerry come in with the timing, David.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you very much, Leader. The timing of the demolition and subsequent development is contingent on two main factors. Firstly, obviously, is the time it will take us to obtain vacant possession. We were hoping, and we are hoping, that we will get that agreement with all the existing owners and tenants by the early part of next year. It is always possible, however, that we will not find it as easy to meet that deadline because of the situation with COVID and the impact it's had on the retail trade. It's making life very difficult for people like Primark and Boots and so on, and they're finding it difficult to find time to make decisions about what to do with their various property assets. So I have to be honest and be upfront with the Cabinet and advise that despite our intention to try and get vacant possession by the early part of next year, there's always a chance that could be extended because of the situation that the major retailers are finding themselves in. And I think that period of uncertainty might encourage them to try and stay in the centre for longer than they might otherwise have been the case. So that's the first thing that needs to be, that will determine the time frame. The second thing that will determine the time frame is the funding of the subsequent development. So at the same time as we're trying to obtain vacant possession, the developers are putting together proposals to secure funding for the new scheme, the one that was approved at planning. And clearly, again, due to the uncertainty within the commercial real estate market at the minute, largely due to COVID, it could be a delay in getting that funding package together for a number of reasons, not least of which, I guess, the situation around retail, forecast rents, and so on. Nobody's quite sure what this is going to do to the retail market in terms of rental income in the years ahead. So there might be some uncertainty around some of the numbers on the development appraisal, and that might lead to some delay. So to cut a long story short, I can't give you a definitive date because obviously these two things could move. I would say there's a third element actually in the equation, which is I don't want to minimise or maximise the importance of this, but we do have a nesting kestrel in the town, in the clock tower in the town hall, and that determines what people can do in and around the vicinity of the town hall in terms of making much noise. So demolition and construction is not something that would be allowed to go ahead during the nesting season, and the nesting season runs from the end of March until September. So we've got a couple of, if we don't get if we don't meet the spring next year date for getting vacant possession and starting demolition, the likelihood is that we will have no option but to aim for September of 2021. And so, you know, clearly that will not change. That nesting period remains the same. So short answer is, well, hopefully either be the spring of next year or be the autumn of next year, one of the two. It certainly won't be the summer of next year because we'll not be allowed to start demolition during that period.
Thank you, Leader. If I come back very quickly, yeah, I mean, this is in relation to what Jerry has just said in relation to funding. I mean, my understanding was that the funding package was in place. The local authority has provided assurances for any kind of gaps in terms of income for the developers, and there was a report approved at the cabinet back in February or March time. Now, from what you are saying, that is not the case. So essentially, if that funding is not forthcoming, this redevelopment may not go ahead. Is that what you're saying?
Leader, if I may just be clear on this, there was no paper presented. There was a confidential paper presented to Cabinet in March on another scheme, not on Crompton Place. The Crompton Place funding cannot be or could not be finalised until they had planning consent. They only obtained planning consent a matter of months ago, and so it's really, and then subsequent to obtaining planning consent, they have to do some more detailed work around the design and to meet some of the conditions linked to that planning consent. So there's always a period between planning consent, the number of months before you get to the point where you've got all your numbers and you're clear about what they are. And it's at that point in time you can start to seriously talk to people about funding. And I guess that's where we are now. And it could be a matter of months to put that funding package together. As I say, in the current uncertainty, I've got to assume that it might just take a bit longer than a couple of months. And therefore, I would expect that all things being equal, we'd be in a position to start demolition in the spring of next year with vacant possession. We'd also have the funding in place by spring of next year. We wouldn't obviously start the demolition until the funding was in place. So everything's heading towards March-ish, February, March of next year probably. If not, then it'll be delayed until September because of the Falcon situation, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Councillor Donaghy.
Thanks, Leader. It's a question really on the timing again. Jerry sort of explained where we are. Obviously, the report as led out before us on the question of the land acquisition and the CPO to run in tandem, obviously, with any private treaty negotiations that can take place. If we can do it by the private treaty, great, that's fantastic. If we can't, then obviously we have to look to other measures. It's the staff in Crompton Place. Now, the rumours that were circulating, and Jerry's just give credence to them now, it's great. So the rumours that were circulating a few weeks ago was that the delay would probably, the staff were told, particularly on the FM side of things, that this was their last Christmas, and of course they would be out of the building by January of 2021. Then the rumour went round that wouldn't be the case, that they would be still there at Easter. Then the rumour further went round, no, that wouldn't be the case either. They could possibly be there up to the end of next summer, 2021. Jerry's very good, he's come in there on September. My question is, how do we consult with the people in Crompton Place who seem to know nothing of what Jerry has just put forward to us on a potential timescale, and because of the factors that he has mentioned? How are we consulting with the people who are directly affected by this proposal? How are we doing that, please?
Leader, I'll give the answer to that. It's quite simple, really. I think there are over 72 people that we had to negotiate with, owners or tenants in the Crompton Place. We're down to pretty much the last half dozen or so that we still have to strike a deal with. So actually, we've been consulting with all of them for some time now, and we've reached deals with all of them on their leases. So, but the consultation is with the owner or the leaseholder, not with necessarily the employees of the various businesses in the shopping centre. And the reason for that is very simple. It's not for us to consult with employees of leaseholders in the shopping centre. It's for the leaseholder to consult with their employees. So there may be some store managers, for example, who don't know very much about what's happening, but that's primarily because they're not getting any information from the business who owns the lease. And that's not something that we would normally be involved in, to be honest, Councillor Donaghy. So, but it is the case that we've been consulting and engaged with all the owners and tenants in that building for some time, and we are at the point where we're really only talking about a handful now that we've got to reach a private treaties with. The paper today, the proposal for CPO is simply in case any of these last half dozen prove to be particularly problematic, or indeed even if we get a private treaty, we may still want to run a CPO just to make sure that there are nothing that we've missed out and that there's not somebody sitting with a postage stamp ownership of a postage stamp of building in Crompton Place. So it normally with these consolidation exercises, you would run a CPO as a sweep up operation at the end. So that's primarily the purpose of the paper today, to allow us to be able to do that. I hope that answers the question. I'm sure it does.
Well, sorry, if I could just come back very briefly, Leader. It does answer most of my question, but the problem I have is that, for example, I'm sorry about my clock. It's running a bit fast as well, so you'll have to forgive it.
It's going to frighten away.
The cleaners, the maintenance staff, etc., have no idea what is going on and what the timescale is for the closure of the centre, etc. Now, it may well be that the higher ups in that regime has been consulted, but certainly at even manager level within Crompton Place, they don't know what's going on. The people who look after the facilities management people, cleaners, maintenance staff, etc. So my plea is, can you just please ensure that the people who need to be spoken to, who control the other minions, if you like, down the scale, that they are consulted and that they in turn can pass on what you've just said to us to those employees to put their minds at rest, please. Thank you.
We will do that.
Jerry, yes, you'll do that, yeah. Thank you. Councillor Peel.
Thanks, Leader. When we last discussed the Crompton Place, the UK was in the midst of a diplomatic row with the People's Republic of China. If you remember, Jerry, I asked you, are there any worries about that? And you quite cleverly and quickly threw back, well, no, really, because it's registered in the UK. But what you didn't tell us, and what it wasn't reported in the press, is it might be registered in the UK, but it's owned by the Chinese government, and doesn't matter where the company's registered. If the Chinese government is telling you pull out, you do as you're told. But I am pleased that seems to have calmed down a bit for the moment, and things seem to be going okay. When we were at planning committee discussing this, the report was quite clear that demolition work would start in January. I appreciate now that Jerry's told us that a minimum slippage of 2 months to March, but due to kestrel nesting season, there could be the slippage of this project, could be 8 months further on to September. My plea is the council needs to be massively upfront about this and let people know as soon as it knows, because we naturally, all of us, are investors in our town centre. We all want this to be a resounding success, and I would argue nobody no more than the Labour group, because we set this in motion. We got this going with this grand vision of new housing, new workforce, new communities in the town centre. It's so important for our town, for our borough in general, that this goes ahead. So we all want to see it work. But my plea is to yourselves, to Tony, to David, etc., is if there are worries about slippage and projects falling back, and then we've got the other intervention zones as well, be as upfront as you possibly feel you can be for the people of Bolton, because Councillor Zaman's right. There's so much unfair, and it is unfair, scepticism out there. We suffer from it, you're suffering from it, which is, I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when I see it. I've heard all this before. And there's an awful lot of people say that, and they want to see cranes in the sky. They want to see boots on the ground. So if things slip, like this project, and then other projects start to slip, and maybe they're COVID related, maybe the business confidence related, then let people know as soon as possible via local media, etc., so that we don't lose the goodwill of the people of Bolton, those who fully understand what we're trying to achieve are well behind it. It doesn't matter which party is in control, they all want it to succeed. So let's not risk losing the goodwill of the people there. Thanks.
David, if I could just come in.
Yeah.
I think Councillor Peel makes a fair point. I think this does have a cross-party support, and everybody wants to see it succeed. And nobody wants to see this do anything other than succeed. I'm sure he's aware, as are others, the complexity you get around big real estate development in terms of securing planning permission, securing financing. In our case, it's not just buying up the properties in Crompton Place. It's buying up the leases. That requires relocations. It's enormously complex at the best of times. And therefore giving sort of security of of programme is difficult. And I think we've had layered on top of that. I mean, it's a worn out cliche, but it was never better employed than it is now, that we're in really unprecedented times. Nobody could have predicted what happened back in February and March, and that to some extent is going to have a knock-on effect in terms of our programmes. But we're in no mood to keep anything from anybody in terms of programme, in terms of progress. We take your point. You're pushing against an open door, and as soon as we know, we'll let others know. But what was initially a very, very complicated process has been complicated even further by something that we couldn't predict. You couldn't have predicted when you initially purchased Crompton Place. But it's something that we are committed to getting off the ground, and if things change, we'll let you know. But I think Jerry has done his best to try and articulate what we see at this point in time as the way forward. Thanks, Leader. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. And just to give certainly Councillor Peel, Councillor Donegal, Councillor Zaman some assurances. All the questions that you've asked, all the frustrations that you've shown today have equally shown by us in when we've had the briefings as a cabinet, and I have to say, not as calmly presented as sometimes by us as by yourselves today in this cabinet meeting, because for the very reasons you've stated, Nick, There is a great deal of cynicism out there, and for the, again, if I can use the terminology of the perfect storm that Martin has created in terms of the challenge that COVID has brought us at this time as well, the delays are hugely frustrating for everyone, and I can't emphasize that enough. And I totally understand your view about us being as open and as upfront as we possibly can, and probably the reality is we are doing our very, very best to move it forward as quickly as we possibly can with all the challenges, bearing in mind the challenges that we currently face. But at the end of the day, nobody can put an accurate time scale onto when we will actually be able to be in full control of the whole site. And when it was announced all those years ago, and it is years ago now, that Crompton Place had been purchased, I think it probably wasn't fully appreciated the amount of work that still remained to fully own all. I think Jerry has mentioned it today, 72 further individual contracts had to be made with individual owners and leaseholders and owners of properties. And that has been no mean feat. And for us to get to the position where we are with only a handful remaining is really significant. But we all wish we could be in a position where we could be sat here today saying that we're ready to go, everything's signed off, and let's get it demolished and let's move forward, because we all want to silence those cynics. We all want to silence the deniers, the people who say, oh, it's all talk, we've all heard it before, because it is ambitious and we deserve it to be ambitious. The town, we deserve it to our town for it to be ambitious, and we have all got still the same ambition, I know, across all parties, to see real change in our town centre, and the ambition is still there to deliver that as soon as we possibly can. So I hope that gives some assurances. So the recommendation, Cabinet, is to it's to update, the purpose to update Cabinet members on the progress to date. So Cabinet is recommended to note that the detailed recommendations are set out in the report at paragraph 16. Could I just ask you all to unmute and give your approval, please?
Approved. I approved.
Thank you. That is approved. That brings the meeting to a close. Thank you for joining us today. And that is the end of the meeting of Cabinet. Thank you.